When a studio is making a sequel to a video game, there are a number of technical ways to go about it. Do you want to continue the story of the first game? Do you want to tell a different story? Do you want a different main character? Do you want a different gameplay system? The list goes on and on. But no matter the various decisions and paths developers make, the overall goal of every game sequel is generally the same. It needs to be better than the first game. But to carry out this goal, what can developers do? Well, the most straightforward thing they can do is take what worked in the first game and expand upon it. But just as importantly, take what did not work and resolve it based on feedback. Whether this is actually fixing the issue or removing it entirely, it does not necessarily matter as long as it's resolved. In my opinion, this is what the bare minimum should be with sequels. Fix the issues of the previous game. Beyond this, there are more specific ways developers can achieve this goal of creating a better sequel, such as crafting or telling a better story, but I will dig deeper into those later. For now, I will focus on the bare minimum, and how, curiously, Hellblade 2 largely fails as a worthwhile video game sequel. First things first, Hellblade 2 is a good game, at some points even a great game, but there is a word that keeps coming up in written and video reviews of this game: disappointing. There are actually many reviews that say this game is good, even really good, but still say it's disappointing. Why is this? Because Hellblade 2 had expectations, something the first game did not really have. But of course this makes sense. Hellblade 2 is a sequel, and if a game is going to be a truly good sequel, it needs to at least do the bare minimum. Fix the previous game's issues and/or expand what the previous game did well. By doing this, the sequel already starts out at least somewhat better than the first game, at least on a technical level. To be clear, Hellblade 2 does do some things better. It has better graphics and animations, the music is great, and the overall audio design is improved from the first game. Unfortunately, this is where the list ends for me. Hellblade 2, and by extension its studio, Ninja Theory, essentially did not improve anything else. Let's start with the puzzles. In the first game, the puzzles were generally treated as a negative. Many were unsatisfying and time-consuming. In Hellblade 2, they did not improve upon the puzzles whatsoever. In actuality, they made them even less satisfying. One example is that the game heavily snaps to the answer in vision quests or finding secret paths. Additionally, in the first game, at least solving a puzzle would do something. It would change the landscape and level in some way. In Hellblade 2, that's not usually the case. If you start the ball puzzle, sure, it changes to a different environment, but solving it puts you right back where you were. Moreover, many puzzles are just as time-consuming, seemingly just for the sake of being time-consuming. Like here and in many puzzles, you run back and forth a lot. Ultimately, what stood out to me the most is that they kept many of the same types of puzzles from the first game and did not do anything new with them. They did this years after hearing how players did not like them in the first game. It's pretty insane. Then there's the combat. The first game's was straightforward and relatively basic. Some people hated it, some people really liked it, but a majority thought it was simply passable. So when Ninja Theory talked about how they created a new combat system from the ground up, it got many excited. It sure got me excited. How were they going to make the combat better? How would they expand upon it? Well, it turns out the answer is they simply did not. They actually removed a couple moves Senua could do in the first game and made it so combat is 1v1 even if the other enemies are near. This is a large issue because nothing was truly expanded upon or added to the combat gameplay. This is one of the largest issues with the sequel. Combat in the first Hellblade, to me and to a majority of people, was not an issue. It was a feature of the game that was simply fine, passable. On top of this, the combat in the first game was more than just strictly gameplay. It serviced the overall narrative quite well, even though the gameplay itself was basic. This was exemplified perfectly in the first game's finale, when Senua is fighting an endless wave of enemies until she eventually gives up. It perfectly showed Senua's state of mind and the emotional journey she was going on. Combat was never an issue that needed to be removed or simplified or scaled back in any way. Instead, it was a feature that needed to be improved and expanded upon in its sequel. That's at least what most fans wanted. Alas, the devs made the combat worse, or at best the same, and simplified it. There were so many expansions they could have done. Add one or two more parry mechanics, add a shield Senua can use, even add a few combos players can naturally figure out by mixing heavy and light attacks, or add another ability her mirror can do in battle from getting focus. Maybe even be able to give one-time commands to comrades in fights, literally anything to expand it in some way. All of this still keeps the fighting grounded, but expands upon it in huge ways. That the devs did nothing, in my opinion, is crazy. Also, don't forget Hellblade 2 does not lie to you about permadeath like the first game does, so combat encounters are naturally not as intense to the player because if you die, who cares? Ultimately, the combat system in Hellblade 2 pales in comparison to the first game. Then there are a bunch of other factors to briefly touch upon. In Hellblade 2, the level design is about the same as the first game. It's still very linear, even more linear than Hellblade 1 at times. But more importantly, the story and storytelling is largely different in the sequel. The story is much more cinematic and less personal, as it focuses much more on the overall plot. In other words, instead of focusing on Senua, she is used as a vehicle to continue and progress the plot. This inherently means that the story is less personal, so Senua's individual and emotional journey is far inferior compared to the first game. In fact, Senua barely talks in this game at many points or gives her thoughts. We rarely get to see what she is actually thinking and wants to do. Now, if Hellblade 2's plot and story were really good, then I would not really have anything to complain about. It just would have been a sequel that focused on another type of storytelling, which is fine. Unfortunately, it's a story that becomes muddled because Ninja Theory wants to continue showing personal scenes and experiences with Senua, but because their overall emphasis is on plot and cinematics, going through these Senua scenes don't amount to much emotionally. Ultimately, everything is dealt with on a surface level, including themes, which are all over the place. Hellblade 2 always seems at odds with Hellblade 1 and its themes. For example, Hellblade 1 has Senua come to terms with her trauma by the end of the game, and accepts that she cannot simply move past her psychosis. It's a negative she will need to live with. Yet in Hellblade 2, it's not treated as a negative at all. Her friends get lost in the forest. She's there to guide them because she knows what having voices in her head is like. Giants are wreaking havoc. Her powers allow them to rest, healing the world she is traversing. Additionally, I need to mention characters. In Hellblade 1, the focus on Senua meant she was fleshed out extremely well by the end of the game, but the way other characters were handled was done extremely well. Dillion, Senua's father, and her mother all had their backstories slowly revealed as the game progressed, culminating in Senua's realization of what actually happened, both to her mother and Dillion, and who her father really was as a person. Even Druth was fleshed out very well, because as he narrated and gave more lore, he included his own journey and what happened to him. This all worked well because the game focused on Senua's dynamic with each character and fleshed them all out through her experience. Comparing it to Hellblade 2, it is night and day. Most of the new characters in Hellblade 2 are one note. Thorgester starts as a villain and switches sides. By the end of the game, he goes through the most changes, and it's still not much. Fargrimar you meet and save simply because Senua feels a connection to him. Most of the game, he gives Senua key information, but outside of this, his character is never developed at all. Ostritor is introduced late in the game and is the leader of her tribe. She's given a quick backstory about how her father was betrayed, but outside of this, that's it. That's ultimately the largest issue. The game being 5 to 6 hours means the amount of screen time all these side characters have are extremely short. Unlike Hellblade 1, these characters and Senua do not know each other, so their backstories are separate and disconnected. Since these are not fleshed out, you feel that while playing Hellblade 2. I did not care about any of those characters by the end of the game. Oddly enough, the best new characters are the Giants, who are given quite beautiful and tragic backstories. These scenes flesh out the Giants and the lore pretty well. Lastly, I'll discuss the length of the game. For me personally, my playthrough recordings added up to about 5 hours and 45 minutes. With that being said, there were a few moments where I had to re-record some gameplay because the game crashed, and there were other moments where I stepped away to play with my cats while I was recording. So in reality, my playthrough was shorter than that, and I was not rushing either. To be honest, the length itself is not an issue. It's similar to Hellblade 1's length. But how Ninja Theory spent their time telling this new story was inadequate, and overall it was less impactful by comparison. I could go on, but instead I'll share my final thoughts. Hellblade 2, in my opinion, is a good game, and a good experience. Though few, there are things that the sequel did do better, like graphics and audio. There are also many things I did not touch upon. Good things like the various giant sequences, and bad things like the horrible amount of backtracking you need to do in puzzles. But this video was never intended to be a review. Instead, it's meant to compare both Hellblades and show, from my perspective, how Hellblade 2 fails at being a good and worthwhile sequel. Ultimately, it is a game that would have largely benefited from being created as a new IP or a spiritual successor to Hellblade, not one that directly continued Senua's story as a sequel. By making it a sequel, Ninja Theory created much higher expectations for this game and themselves. Unfortunately, from my view, both Ninja Theory and Hellblade 2 failed to meet these expectations. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.